Halo Combat Evolved is a first-person shooter. The game is set in the future on an alien ring, where the player must fight a variety of alien factions who combined are known as the Covenant. The main gameplay premise of the game is to kill all the enemies the player comes across, and reach the end of the level to achieve an objective. The player is given a range of tools, weapons, and vehicles to eliminate opposing enemies. In this video I shall be playing Halo Combat Evolved on the heroic difficulty in the single-player mode. Halo Combat Evolved enables meaningful play by its many routes of overcoming encounters with enemies. These different routes come in the form of weapons to use, current health, enemy types, the environment, and the vehicles that are available to both the player and the enemies. The meaningful player section of this video will be sectioned into these variables. There are a variety of enemy types for the Covenant in Halo Combat Evolved. These are the Grunts, the Jackals, the Elites, and the Hunters. I will only be discussing the Covenant enemy types of this video, as I believe they represent the core meaningful choices of the game more than the other enemy types. The Grunts are weak but numerous, the Jackals provide a shield which protects its allies, the Elites have their personal recharging shield, as well as powerful weapons, and the Hunter is huge but slow, acting as a mini-boss. All these different enemy types together form the meaningful play of the game. As such, they can be described as orthogonal enemy design due to their unique attributes and roles. Halo Combat Evolved only allows the player to carry 2 weapons at a time, making weapon management a crucial part of meaningful play. There are a multitude of weapons in Halo Combat Evolved, which each has its strengths and weaknesses depending on what enemy they are being used against. For instance, the pistol is good for clearing through lesser enemies because it is able to instantly kill an unshielded enemy with a headshot. Halo Combat Evolved uses a shield that regenerates for the player, helping the flow of the game so that each encounter in a level can be balanced around the same amount of health that the player is expected to have. However, the player also has a secondary health bar which does not regenerate automatically, and can only be replenished by health kits which are scattered across the level. The environment of combat encounters can drastically change tactics for the player. This is because the effectiveness of weapons and vehicles are changed based on distance between the enemies and the player, as well as maneuverability. In close range environments, a shotgun will be a more desired option for the player instead of a pistol. The meaningful play of Halo Combat Evolved expresses itself when all these previously mentioned elements combine during combat encounters. When a player enters a room full of enemies, they have many options to juggle in their head based on the current situation. They will be thinking, what enemy should I prioritise? If I can kill the Elites before their shield recharges, then a large amount of the damage output is gone, and the Grunts will run away in fear. But instead I could kill this clustered group of Jackals with a grenade, and have an easier time picking up the Grunts. Should I waste precious rocket launcher ammo to make this encounter easier? What current weapons do I have? Does this facilitate me choosing a different strategy, which could make better use of my ammo? When these choices are made, the player can directly express their style and plan into the game, whether it be a defensive player who will rely more on range weapons to pick off weaker enemies, or an aggressive player who uses sticky grenades and power weapons to kill powerful enemies quicker at the cost of ammo. Furthermore, players are shifted into different choices than they would usually make based on their ammo and enemy types they are facing. This stops the player from relying on one strategy for most of the game, and keeps choices interesting. After an encounter, the player is rewarded with direct feedback on whether their strategy was effective based on their remaining health. This is evaluative of meaningful play, as it affects other outcomes throughout the level, altering their difficulty and how careful the player should approach the next group of enemies. This can also result in the player having to adapt their strategies once again to facilitate a safer style of approach. This is only possible because of the 2-weapon restriction placed upon the player. If the player could simply carry every weapon in the game at once, then they could simply pick the most optimal weapon for the scenario without consideration of the encounter. On the contrary, a player with a high amount of remaining health is rewarded with an easier approach to the next encounter. This is an example of a positive feedback loop within the game, and makes the player feel satisfied for using the correct weapons and strategies for the situation. The core dynamic of Halo Combat Evolved is destruction. This is because the goal of the player is to eliminate every opponent in sight to progress to the end of the level. Halo understands that this is its core dynamic, and so balances levels with this in mind. As such, there is little downtime or exploration between combat scenarios, reinforcing the core dynamic of destruction. The fact that the player's shield can recharge is essential for the pacing of the game and allowing its core dynamic to shine through. Due to the player's recharging shield, each combat scenario can be balanced around the idea that the player will be at a similar health level for each encounter. As such, the designers can carefully plan out the intensity of encounters without worrying that the player will be too weak to overcome it due to their low health. This amplifies the destruction aspect of the game, as the player's momentum is much less likely to be grounded to a halt based on oversights and encounters, allowing them to consistently apply the core dynamic. Additionally, recharging shields improve the pacing of the core dynamic. At the end of each encounter, the player can progress forward with no unnecessary downtime. For instance, if the game uses a static singular health bar system, then the end of each encounter will be bogged down by the player having to search the environment for health packs. Recharging shields means that the player can move forward without downtime, improving the pacing of the game by applying the core dynamic consistently. The core dynamic is enhanced by visceral effects. When the player performs a successful and positive action in the game displays it clearly to the player. Examples of this include a headshot versus a grunt producing an over-the-top flip, or an elite stopping to yell at the player when they are hit by a sticky grenade, only to be killed by a colourful explosion. This is important towards the core dynamic of the game, as these particular actions encourage the player to continue these actions for the purpose of the destructive core dynamic. For this video, I will be using Fullerton's formal elements as a framework for Halo Combat Evolved. In the single player of the game, the role of the player is to beat the enemies displayed to them. As such, the responsibility of the player is described as a player versus game. However, the campaign allows for another player to join in as a direct copy of the player to fight the same enemies. In this case, the game becomes cooperative versus the game. When this occurs, the meaningful choices available are increased as the normal 2-weapon limit is doubled. Because of this, a higher variety of weapon combinations can be utilised to tackle encounters in a more efficient manner. The closest applicable objective under Fullerton's formal elements to Halo Combat Evolved is the solution objective. This can be justified by the encounters that the players put into, and how they must find the correct strategy for the situation. In other words, encounters within Halo are like an open-ended puzzle, where there are many answers to the problem proposed to the player. Like other games with a solution objective, Halo has constraints which come in the form of its enemies. In this case, the enemies serve as the puzzle itself and can shift the current state of the puzzles through AI's decision making. This is what makes the game unique and refreshing, as this metaphorical puzzle forces the player to make different meaningful choices in each playthrough. In terms of procedures, the player will aim at the enemy and use guns, grenades and vehicles to try and kill them. Depending on what enemy they are facing in the environment, the player will choose the appropriate tool. For instance, the player may use a shotgun in a very tight environment, but may use a very powerful tank if available in a large environment. How the player kills the enemy depends on the tool they choose. The shotgun will require them to aim precisely and be close to the enemy, whilst the tank requires less precision in aim, as its splash damage from its fire can kill most enemies in one hit. Definitive rules within the game include plasma weapons dealing more damage to shields, whereas ballistic weapons are effective against no shields. Furthermore, precision weapons such as the pistol and sniper rifle will instantly kill unshielded enemies with a headshot. Explosive weapons like grenades and rocket launchers produce splash damage at their initial impact. Restrictive rules are prevalent in Halo. An example of this is the 2-weapon limit, which forces weapon management and planning. Another instance of a restrictive rule is how the player cannot move faster than a set amount on foot. This consistency in movement speed means the player can easily plan how they want to maneuver around the environment to find cover or ammo in the middle of an encounter. Rules can determine effects. If the player's health drops to 0, then they will die, and the game will restart from the last checkpoint. Moreover, if the player is stuck by a plasma grenade, then they will be instantly killed. Like other games, Halo Combat Evolved has durational, expendable, and enhancements as resources. The most obvious and only durational resource is the player's health. Without access to this resource, aka the player dying, then the player's ability to act is lost. Ammo and weapons are the player's main expendable resource, as they directly influence how the player approaches combat encounters but are limited in how much they are available. Vehicles are also expendable resources, as they not only change how the player acts through their choices, but also changes their controls. Like ammo, vehicles are also a short-term resource capable of being destroyed or not usable in many areas of the game. Power-ups, such as the overshield and active camouflage, exist within Halo and act as enhancement resources. These improve the capabilities of expendable resources such as the weapons, by making it easier to execute their effective strategies. An example of this is how the active camouflage allows the player to sneak up on enemies to close a distance, and use the full damage output available from the shotgun. Additionally, the environment can be considered as an enhancement as it improves the capabilities of the expendable resources just like the power-ups. A sniper rifle is improved greatly when the environment allows for long-distance fights, whereas tight corridors will make the rocket launcher's wide area of effect incredibly effective. The only type of conflict present in Halo Combat Evolved is opponents. Despite there only being one type of conflict, this is beneficial for the game design. This is because the game's core dynamic of destruction can remain as the focal point. In most cases, this would result in repetitive gameplay. However, in the case of Halo Combat Evolved, the amount of dynamic, meaningful choices available to the player make the singular type of conflict refreshing, even through multiple playthroughs. Because the game is set in a distant sci-fi future, there are very little restrictions of what the player is capable of in terms of theme. Within the game's universe, the player should be able to move anywhere within the Halo ring. However, the system simply cannot allow that in order to maintain the core dynamic of the game. Because of this, kill zones and tool walls prevent the player from progressing outside of developed areas. Halo Combat Evolved has an explicit outcome. This is because the win condition is binary, meaning that the player either finishes all the levels or they do not. There is no variable that determines how well the player can finish the game. Thank you for watching.